Let's get into it. So James Krause, as you may know, longtime MMA fighter, veteran, well-respected fighter, became a well-respected coach as well. And, has his gym, Glory MMA, out of Kansas City that trains the likes of Jeff Molina and Brandon Moreno recently, Julian Marquez, Derek Minner, Marcelo Rojo. There's about 10 or so fighters from the UFC who are fighting in the UFC or were fighting in the UFC that have come out of that gym. Also in the past, the likes of Megan Anderson and many others. Back in April, as far as we can tell, right, GC, as far as we can tell, go ahead.
As far as we know, going back, like you can see, like this is from the Discord channel, and it says that it started on Friday, April 8th. I went back on Twitter, searching prior to this date. I couldn't find anything tweeting about it. The earliest tweet I can see is mid-April. Someone tweeted about James Krause now has a Discord. He's giving out picks. It looks like he's got about 1,000 members now. He's charging $50 a month.
Pause right there.
Sure.
What is a Discord channel?
So a Discord channel is kind of like it's essentially like a large group chat that people can come, they can join.
Pay to be involved?
You don't have to pay. There are numerous Discords that are free. I mean, it's essentially what the name is. It's a Discord. It's for conversation to talk about specific topics and, have deep discussions. As you can see by the picture as well, it looks like by the time, which it is now gone, if you go to this link to try and join it, I tried several times. It's always invalid. It has been deleted, but it looks like at the time of deletion, it was at almost 5,000 members.
All right. So it's called the 1% Club. And we see here, this is as of Friday, April 8th, 2022. Now, as you all know, gambling has become very popular in North America, around the world. We are sponsored by, obviously, a sportsbook, DraftKings Sportsbook. The UFC is sponsored by them. Every single sports entity is sponsored by some sort of, sports book. And I believe you may know the number off the top of your head. It's 30-something states at this point that have legalized it. Am I right about that?
Yes, it's in that range.
Yeah, New York, New Jersey, obviously Nevada was the the pioneer, if you will, but now it's just spreading everywhere, and it's become just a massive, massive business, a gigantic business. It's changed sports media. It continues to change sports. So everyone is getting involved. And back then, if you're a UFC fighter, there were no real restrictions as to what you could do. If you were a UFC coach, manager, whomever, there were no restrictions as to what you could do. In addition to this Discord channel, James Krause had a podcast called the 1% Club podcast. You see May 31st, episode 1 with Brandon Moreno. You see episode 2 was on June 3rd, just a few days later, breaking down UFC Vegas, the one headlined by Jairzinho Rozenstruik and
Alexander
Volkov. In addition to this, prior to this, James Krause was starting to develop a reputation as a picks master, if you will. He was hosting a podcast for ESPN MMA called Best Bets, right? And once he started this, he had kind of left that. I even asked him about that later on. So here are sort of the early beginnings of him seriously getting into this world. Not to suggest that there wasn't anything going on before, but this felt like a good place to start. All right, so now we move along.
You want to go to the video?
Yes. And when we move on, what's the next one? Very interested in the betting side of things. Like how often do you partake in this? All right, so now we move along to August 1st. August 1st is when James Krause was on this show, and this clip has been brought up a lot over the last few weeks and days. This was right after Brandon Moreno won the interim title against Kai Kara France. And the main reason why we had him on was to talk about that win. But in perusing his social media and his Instagram in particular, noticed that he was doing, like, I'll be honest, back then I don't really pay attention to any of this stuff, but you see on his Instagram, he was having a lot of snazzy videos made of him making picks, talking about picks, breakdowns, and all that stuff. So I asked him about all of this towards the end of the interview, if my memory serves me correct. I was just curious about like his passion and his interest in this world. So this is that conversation. Very interested in the betting side of things. Like, how often do you
Yeah.
partake in this?
Oh, I bet every single card, just about every fight.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a Discord, like 2,000 members in it. We crushed it last week. We destroyed it. Like I take over people's accounts and play for them. Like I post the losses, myself on some accounts. Like I do pretty well. I make more money gambling on MMA than I do anything else.
Come on, more than even coaching?
Oh God, I don't make shit on coaching.
Really?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely not. Like, I mean, if you're talking about time,
Yeah.
no, like if I go out on a Wednesday,
That's
I
true.
go out on a Wednesday to Sunday. That's you know what I mean? I make 10% of a guy that's majority of, I mean, if we're not talking about Brandon Moreno, like
Right.
most of my guys are entry level guys making 12, 14, 14. I have some guys making in the 20s, but even at that, like you get 10% of 20 grand is $2,000. I'm on the road every weekend,
Right.
Wednesday to Sunday. You know what I mean? Like it just doesn't. No, to answer your question, no, it's not even close. Not even close.
And just curious, like the Moreno fight, like fights that you're involved in, will you bet on those too?
Yeah,
Wow, that's
sometimes,
did you bet on Brandon?
of course.
Overall, how'd you do Saturday?
We crushed it, man. Crushed it. I think I went like 15-2, and the two losses, one was a plus 900 underdog, and the other one was a hedge on another play we won.
Damn, look at you. And when you say we, what do you mean by we? The Discord?
The Discord, the group,
Got it.
the group we're in. I post the plays and people,
And do
play
people
with us.
pay you for this? For the picks?
Yep.
Wow. And that's
Yep.
lucrative.
Yep.
Look
Does
at
really
you.
well. But it does. But I mean, they make way more. You know what I mean?
Sure,
Way more.
sure.
Like we have a couple different entry level positions. Like we have a $50 a month and I have a $2,000 a month. But they make way more than they make way more than they pay. That's for sure.
And just if someone wanted to join this, how can they sign up for this? How does that work?
The link is in my bio and all my stuff.
Okay.
I have a link tree on there. It's all on that. Yep.
Look at you. So there you have it. And I remember talking to the guys in the back there. I was like, man, he's like very sort of open about this stuff. And to be fair, I guess to him back then, nothing that he was saying was illegal, but he was just very, very open about it. Is that accurate, GC and Rick? Because I know you take a great interest in this. Nothing that he said there was illegal, correct?
At the time, no. I mean,
but alarming.
By the UFC's mandates and their standards, no, it wasn't illegal. But now, when you're looking back on it and you reframe your mind of like, imagine if that was, the coach of an NBA team being like, oh yeah, smashed them. I hammered our line, like for sure. Like I knew we were going to win going into it. It is like very concerning. Like you have to imagine how much insider information he had behind the scenes of being around the sport so much.
There's an important thing to note here, that is there's the UFC's regulations, right? And then there's regulators of gambling and federal government involvement. That's where this crosses over from just a specific UFC fighter, coach, manager, athlete specific conversation and into legality, like true federal legality or even state legality, because a lot of the regulatory things are state or locality based. So as long as he wasn't betting against his own athletes, I believe that is legal.
Wow. So if it's betting for them, in favor of them, that's okay?
I think it depends on the jurisdiction and the location. And we've also seen this, right? Like there will be athletes who talk about betting on themselves. Floyd Mayweather, notoriously has bet on himself many times. So there are many different jurisdictions and over people who have oversight onto this that are involved. So I think the answer is it depends. But as far as what he said, essentially, it was above board, but there's reason for concern.
Very confident in speaking about this. Dare I say a tad smug as well. But maybe he was trying to sell his product, right? Couldn't believe in the moment. Like I'll be honest, I have some regrets in that moment. The one question that I wish I asked, and I was a little bit taken aback, that's why I kind of chuckled. I wish I asked, did you ever bet against your guys, right? Because we know that people have openly talked about betting for, and I'm certain he would have said no. But I wish I asked that question. And all of this, in retrospect, reminds me a lot of the Maguire-Sosa scandal of the late 90s, where in retrospect, everything looks worse, and you wish that I'm assuming people who covered them back there wish that they asked questions. once certain rules came into play and once things became crystal clear. Like, of course, how did we miss that? How did we not ask questions about any of this stuff? Here's a coach who's around all these fighters, who's in locker rooms and all this stuff, giving out picks. It's all a little bit weird. It's all a little bit funky. So that's on August 1st. October 17th, the UFC releases this memo to all the fighters, all the managers, anyone's associated with a fighter regarding betting on UFC fights. And there's one very pertinent section in this memo. Athletes are prohibited from placing any wagers directly or through a third party on any UFC match, including placing any wagers on themselves. In most states with legalized sports betting, wagering by an athlete directly or through a third party on any MMA match put on by a promoter with which they are affiliated is illegal and may result in criminal sanctions, which leads one to believe, why was this ever allowed? You know what I mean? Athletes should also be aware that in most states, these same prohibitions apply to some or all of relatives living in the same household, athletes' coach, manager, handlers, trainers, medical professionals and staff, any person with access to non-public info regarding participants in an MMA match, right? Someone who knows something, you run, you bet, bad. An athlete that becomes aware or has knowledge of any wagering in violation of these restrictions must immediately notify UFC of such incident in accordance with the UFC athlete conduct policy. Here's the thing. This is October 17th. We're not really quite sure what led to this coming out. You could say the Krause stuff, and maybe it was something else that he said somewhere else. Our show was August 1st. This is October 17th. But when this came out, it was massive because there were a ton of fighters who, A, make money off of picks, B, are sponsored by all kinds of sports books. And they're like, well, how do we really monitor this, right? Like they were wondering, like, how could they know? Well, we did have some sort of indication on the same day by the likes of Chris Wade and Chris Weidman. Chris Wade, not a UFC fighter, was once a UFC fighter. Weidman, of course, in the UFC, who replied to my tweet when I put out this memo that was sent to the fighters and managers. Wade said, I wasn't even allowed to sign up for DraftKings. They knew I fought and denied me an account in New York. Can't even use them to pick football or any other sport. Apparently fighting makes me have inside info on every league and sport. Obviously being a bit facetious there, but interesting to note that they will know what you do for a living. Weidman also writing, same with me on DraftKings. And I've heard this from other fighters as well. Now, we can't be naive, and I know this for a fact. There are people who still use third party, right? And what I mean by third party is, you know, like the non-DraftKings, FanDuel, BetMGM, the ones that people were using before MMA and sports betting at large became legalized in so many states. But we thought that this was really interesting to note. Now, on November 5th, this is where things start to get really, really interesting. Our friend Aaron Bronstetter of TSN, fellow Canadian, who's been doing a great, great job covering this story, tweeted this at 6:38 p.m. Eastern time, so the night of a UFC fight at the Apex. Some crazy line movement in the Shailan Nurdenbecki versus Derek Minner fight over the last 90 minutes. Average odds have moved from minus 237 to 362, minus 362 for Shailan. How much action, GC, would you need for something to move that much in such a short amount of time, so close to a fight?
I mean, an insane amount. And for it to be hanging around the entire week at essentially the same number. I mean, I was obviously watching the fights. I'm on Twitter and everything as the fights are going on. And a couple of people alerted me to the crazy line movement. So as it was going here, if we can show these graphs, like as we're going along, as we're getting closer, I mean, if you just look at that graph, it's Nurdenbecki is hanging around minus 200 all week. And then it just falls off a cliff leading up to the fight. As you can see the dates, it falls off a cliff. Same thing with Derek Minner. His line at the very end just skyrockets as we're going into it. And then obviously, lastly, one of the most suspicious one is Nurdenbecki, the win by KO, TKO, just plummets as the fight is coming. A guy that had 0 UFC finishes prior to this. I mean, this is, I look at Best Fight Odds, FightOdds.io, all these tracking, odds tracker things all the time throughout the entire week. And you never see graphs like this. And it was enough, like, getting the alert of it. A lot of people were incredibly suspicious going in to the fight, entering the bout. I mean, I was watching the fights with Frank, and, like, we were noticing, like, I wonder how this fight is going to go. Like, this is really weird. I think I had Derek Minner by, like, submission or something like that. I had action down on the fight. I was on the wrong side of it, and I was, like, really curious as to what's going to happen here. and then the fight plays out the way that it does, I mean, you can't help but be suspicious of it. I mean, it was you texted me, and I had rewatched it as well. It was over before it even started. Derek Minner made that walk knowing exactly what was about to happen.
Any truth to the rumor that Frank was on top of the story first?
Yeah, I think there is a little bit. I mean, he can speak to that more.
Frank? You saw something.
I was on top of this before anyone else.
Yep.
There we go.
Well done. Rewatched it recently and throws a kick, winces, throws the same kick with the same leg. And then it's interesting when you watch the fight, the Nurmagomedov-Minner fight, even the commentary is interesting. Now, not suggesting for a second, please, that they knew anything, but when they're talking about like, oh, it looks like he's tapping in the midst of the ground and pound, it's clear that he wanted out, right? And so, all right, is there a correlation there? Did they know that Minner was hurt and then told everyone to bet on him losing in the first round? Did he just say, like, let me throw caution to the wind here, and I'm probably going to blow my knee out? Because I do believe on his Instagram afterwards, he's posting pictures of him in a cast and all this stuff. In any event, all that, line movement that suggested that people were betting on a first round finish, right, for Nurmagomedov, they all knew something. They were all right. They didn't have some crazy premonition. So these are scenes right here that you're seeing of Minner during that fight, after that fight. It's crazy to watch in retrospect. You can still see it, by the way. The fight is up on ESPN Plus. If you are living in the States, you can still see it. It's up there. All right, now we move along to November 6th, and the UFC's betting integrity partner, Don Best Sports, puts out a statement that they are conducting a thorough review following the Minner-Nurmagomedov bout on November 5th. Quote, like many professional sports organizations, UFC works with an independent betting integrity service to monitor wagering activity on our events. This is from a UFC statement. Our betting integrity partner, Don Best Sports, a leading global supplier of real-time betting data for North American sporting events, will conduct a thorough review of the facts and report its findings. At this time, we have no reason to believe either of the athletes involved in the bout or anyone associated with their teams behaved in an unethical or irresponsible manner, end quote. All right, interesting. Now we move along to November 11th, and prior to UFC 281, Dana White is doing his post-weigh-in scrum, and this is in New York City, of course. Aaron Bronstetter, again of TSN, asks him about this fight and the controversy surrounding it. This is what he said.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things. There's absolutely zero proof that anybody that was involved bet on it. So it's just, there was some, there was some signs out there that something was going on, but there's absolutely no proof that anybody did anything wrong. And hopefully by seeing this again in this investigation, it deters people from doing it, from betting on it. The bottom line is this: you're never going to be able to bet enough money to win. It's not worth the risk to bet on one of these fights. First of all, nobody even took the action on the fights.
That's not
they
true.
Just saw that type of action was trying to come in, and
Can we pause for a second?
And it got shut down. But hopefully.
You just said that's not true. That's a crazy statement when the line only moves, and we're going to go back to that, by the way. The line only moves because of the action, right?
Yes. I mean, I just go back to one of the original articles after this came out, ESPN.com, David Purdom. They've done a fantastic job of covering this. And there's a paragraph that I go back to after listening to that Dana White thing. And it says, as sportsbooks grew suspicious of the unusual betting leading up to the fight, they contacted U.S. Integrity, which in turn conducted a thorough analysis of the situation and alerted state gaming regulators and other sportsbook clients to the irregular betting roughly 3 hours before the fight began at 8 p.m. Eastern. The betting didn't stop. According to the analysis, even after the odds moved to significantly less attractive prices, the relentless betting on the worse odds only increased suspicions among some bookmakers and U.S. Integrity. I mean, we're in today's day and age where it's instantaneous. It's online. Your bet is going to get through. It's not like they set limiters on these online books to whatever they're willing to accept. It's going to be instantaneous, and your bet is going to get through in real time. It feels like Dana is pointing to one singular bet is what set everything off, but according to this U.S. Integrity force or whoever's investigating it, they are saying something different.
Very defiant, very dismissive, but yet, there's data to suggest that it wasn't one singular bet and that there was something very, very suspicious. He, and you look at this, a month later, less than a month later, and you're like, how could you be so sure? And how could you be so dismissive? And how could you be so defiant? That's their MO. Back to the clip.
Money to win, it's not worth the risk to bet on one of these fights. First of all, nobody even took the action on the fights.
Not true.
They just saw that type of action was trying to come in.
Line wouldn't move.
And it got shut down. But hopefully you see how easy that is to detect now, and the risk is not worth the reward.
What do you think happened? Like, why do you think that the line moves so
That
crazily?
stuff happens all the
Good
time in
follow-up.
sports. It happens. I don't
Doesn't.
think anything happened. I think it happens all the time.
Does
it? I think it was being made a bigger deal than it actually was.
Really?
That's a fight with two guys that not a lot of people know about. That's why it's kind of, I think,
And
raised.
you know what?
It's two guys that not a lot of people know about. It's a mid-card fight, right? So that's
Yeah.
why I think it raised some alarms.
Yeah. But it wasn't a big a deal as people were making it out to be.
I don't
It's
think
not that
anyone
big a
was
deal.
really
It
making
happens
it
all the time in sports.
into.
There's absolutely no proof that anybody did anything wrong, but
They should have been making
you
it
can
into
see
an
now
even
how
bigger
easy
deal.
it is to detect if you start doing that. And the bets don't even have to be placed. All they have to do is somebody trying to place the bet. And nobody's going to take a bet that big.
Pause it
on
for a
an
second.
MMA
GC,
fight.
is that true?
Unless
Which part?
He says the bets don't even have to be placed.
They can be alerted. That is one part that I agree with here on what Dana is saying.
Yeah, but the line wouldn't move, right?
Yeah. Bets
So
were
isn't the
placed
proof
on
in the
this.
pudding?
There's no doubt that bets were placed on this. But what he's saying is that it is pretty easily detectable. Like,
Sure. What he's
sportsbooks-
saying is if someone comes in and starts betting 100,000, 200,000, 300,000, people will be like, whoa, wait a second. But he's saying that we stopped it or they stopped
Yeah,
it right before. But
that's
then the
not-
line doesn't move, right? Isn't
Yeah,
isn't that the I'm no expert when it comes to this stuff, but isn't that the best way to determine whether or not there was action placed? Line movement.
Action was placed. I mean, it's in this ESPN.com article. They are stating how much action was placed, and the point of moving the line is to try and get more action on the other side of it, to make the other side more attractive so they can even it out. We've discussed it many times on this show. The goal of the sports book is to have even action on each side, and then they win no matter what because of the juice, because of the VIG built into it. And in this case, they kept trying to make the price worse and worse and worse, and that's what sparked the suspicions. I do agree with Dana for that it is easily detectable. If bets just come pouring in this suspicious manner, it's going to alert them. It's, it's a sports book. It's similar to a casino. Like if someone is counting cards, someone is going to get alerted. Like it is easily detectable, but action was placed on this, and that's why.
Could they void it? Could they say like there's too much suspicious stuff and we're giving everyone their money back?
They definitely could. I don't think that happened here, though. I never saw any reports of people not getting their money because of this fight.
Okay. I think there's still a couple seconds left here.
you can see now how easy it is to detect if you start doing that. And the bets don't even have to be placed. All they have to do is somebody trying to place the bet. And nobody's going to take a bet that big on an MMA fight. Unless you're at one of the casinos and you're a massive player, right? If you're a massive player, the casino would probably take your action. But other than that, you just walk in off the streets and try to throw 30 grand on some obscure guy on the bottom of the card? Yeah, no.
So is that what happened? Someone just placed a really big bet, it raised flags, and it got shut down, and they stopped taking action on the fight?
Yeah. It's very easy to detect. It's very easy to find out who it was. And it's not like these things are impossible to find out. And that's why I'm saying there's zero evidence, literally zero evidence that anybody did anything wrong. Just people got alerted when people started trying to make some bets or questioned about making a big bet on a certain fight.
Now, at this point, I want to make something very clear. Nothing that I have heard, and I'm certain people will twist this, has said to me, suggested to me, anything of that nature that the UFC was involved in any type of shady activity. Now, this is involving a UFC fight and people who coach fight in the UFC, but I don't want anyone to think that we are incriminating the UFC, blaming the UFC, accusing the UFC, or even Dana White of anything. Nothing that I have heard. Now, I have no idea what is going to come of all of this, but nothing that I've heard right now as it pertains to this specific James Krause story involves anyone who works for the UFC. Does that make sense? Now, I think that this clip is very important to play because, Dana White is the face of the UFC, he's the president of the UFC, and he was so defiant. and dismissive of nothing suspicious going on, that I think it's a really interesting moment in the chronology. But as far as what I'm hearing right now from everyone on or off the record, no one in the UFC right now, this could change tomorrow, this could change in an hour, right this second, that no one in the UFC is in hot water, in trouble, being looked at, being investigated for any type of involvement in all of this. I hope that is very clear. Now, we move along to November 19th, and we find out from Miles Johns. This is a tweet from Nolan King, who does such a great job of covering MMA. He was fighting on a UFC card at the Apex, saying that in this tweet, it says the UFC suspended James Krause from cornering him. My understanding is it was a Nevada decision because Nevada removed his license. Obviously, the UFC is going to honor that. Bottom line is, Miles Johns, a Krause fighter, had to go in there without his coach because James Krause was told he is not allowed to corner a fighter in Las Vegas. This is back on November the 19th. Also on that day, and this is when things start to get really, really, really interesting, David Purdom of ESPN tweets out at 9:06 p.m. Eastern Time, November 19th, New Jersey Division of Gaming Enforcement notified the state's sports books today that they are prohibited from taking bets on fights that James Krause is involved in, quote, as a coach, trainer, promoter, or fighter. Gigantic. I mean, this is New Jersey, one of the biggest states in America as far as sports betting is concerned. They are saying we are not taking any action on any fight that is associated with James Krause. Gigantic. Absolutely massive. All right, we continue. November 24th. And by the way, guys, if you want to jump in on any of this, please do. Obviously, we will talk on the back end. November 24th, this is also from David Purdom. The 1% Club Discord, the one that we talked about at the beginning of all this, Discord server and YouTube channel run by UFC coach, MMA coach James Krause, deleted November 24th. Okay, so this was a very successful endeavor. He told you about that in the interview. All of a sudden, gone. The YouTube channel, the Instagram, gone. Twitter, last I checked, as of this weekend, still up there, but
Twitter is still there, yeah.
Still there. Discord and YouTube, gone. December 1st, last week, massive news story. This is just a few days ago. The Ontario Alcohol and Gaming Commission require Ontario gaming operators to stop offering and accepting UFC bets. This is an entire province. This isn't saying, like New Jersey did, no James Krause fights. This is all UFC bets. And there was a line in there, to stop offering and accepting wagers on UFC events due to, quote, concerns about non-compliance with AGCO's betting integrity requirements.
I mean, this was probably the craziest thing that happened out of the whole thing up until this point.
Also in that statement, contrary to the registrar's standards, meaning their own, the UFC does not prohibit all insiders from betting on UFC events, which could include an athlete's coach, manager, handlers, athletic trainers, medical professionals, or other persons with access to non-public information. My understanding is the UFC wasn't blindsided by this. They knew this was coming, and there were talks leading up to this point about what Ontario would do. And then on December 1st, Ontario decided that they were going to stop action. That's gigantic. That's the biggest, most influential province in Canada saying, we have questions about these fights.
What's massive about this is the framing of the conversation, mostly to this point, was around individual bad actors, right? We're talking about, there's speculation about people who may have been involved with something that influenced the outcome of a fight. This is a shift to a much larger picture. This is a shift to something much more significant, where now gambling regulators are looking at UFC and UFC fights and saying, we do not trust that fight fixing can be prevented, and for this organization to oversee that fight fixing can be prevented, which is a completely different conversation, right? It goes from individuals to now this is the entirety of a promotion and for all intents and purposes, the majority of a sport.
Right.
And that is massive. That becomes a completely different
claims
story.
to be made. Massive claims to, I mean, that's when you start messing with the integrity of the UFC at that point.
Yeah. And by the way, on Friday, you could have bet in Ontario on one championship. On Saturday,
Yep.
You could not have bet on the
MMA,
UFC.
yes. Could not on UFC.
I have to admit that confuses me a little bit, right? because if I am a coach or somebody else involved in fights that are not UFC related, there's nothing preventing me at this moment from doing that same thing. And this is shining a light on an issue that's an MMA issue, not specifically a UFC issue, in my opinion. Again, you don't need the UFC to act. Like, they can be completely separate from this, and somebody can influence fights in that way. So I'm confused by that. Don't quite understand it. I think, MMA as a whole kind of needs to be examined there, but understand the largest organization who's putting on the most fights and has the most influence. Certainly, they will be the one with the biggest microscope.
Do we know one championship, Bellator, all these other promotions, do we know that what their gambling standards are? Like, had they already had something in place that the UFC put in place on October 17th? Like, if you gamble, you're out.
We had Brendan Loughnane say that PFL told him he couldn't do the same, but I don't think theirs has been as publicized.
Yeah.
And obviously they're not dealing with this like everyone else. I feel like they're only dealing with it once it hits them in the face. And, worth noting, Ontario, one of the last provinces to legalize MMA, and it was such a big deal to get over that hurdle. And there were people, for the longest time, it was Ontario and New York. They were the two that were the dissenters. And for a sport that fought so hard, and for an organization, let's be honest, because the UFC did all that work. They were on the front lines to get the sport legalized all over North America, and in particular, Mark Ratner, who still works for the UFC. For a sport that fought so hard and so long to be legalized, to be legitimate, for something like this, where you can bet on boxing, but you can't bet on the UFC.
And I believe it was 8 months that they had this single game wagering available, and it took 8 months before it was taken off. And you're talking Toronto, you're talking Ottawa, and like, I can't even put a number on it. Like, a significant amount of people were in my mentions and in my DMs being like, can't bet this weekend. Oh man, wish I could take some picks. Like, wish I could ride with you this weekend, but I can't because I'm in Ontario. Can't bet on it.
So then when this happened on Thursday, we were wondering, all right, who's going to follow suit? Well, the next day, December 2nd, Alberta follows suit. And they come out, and they are now the second province to halt UFC wagering. This on Friday, early afternoon. The quote here, a spokesperson for Alberta Gaming, Liquor, and Cannabis confirmed to MMA Fighting that the AGLC has stopped offering and accepting wagers on UFC events, a decision that was made on December 1st. TSN was first to report the news. Quote, previously placed UFC wagers on playalberta.ca have been voided and the stake returned to the player. AGLC will continue to monitor standards implemented by UFC before reinstating betting options on Play Alberta. Later that evening, at around 5 p.m. or so, UFC released a statement addressing James Krause and Derek Minner. This was sent out once again to all fighters, all managers, everyone associated with the fighters. And the most important part of the statement was on the second page where, quote, they wrote, on November 18th, Nevada State Athletic Commission informed UFC and Minner's coach James Krause that Krause's license was suspended and would remain so while the NSAC conducted an investigation into the matter. The UFC has since advised Krause and the respective managers working with impacted fighters that effective immediately, fighters who choose to continue to be coached by Krause or who continue to train in his gym will not be permitted to participate in UFC events pending the outcome of the aforementioned government investigations. Further, the UFC has released Derek Minner from the organization. Gigantic. Basically, he's out. He's banned. He's been cut out. And so the UFC, I think, puts out this statement to say, look, the cancer is gone. We are cutting him out. The problem is, has the damage been done? Did he shine a light on an issue within the sport that now, with investigations unfolding, and I'm told on the radar of the FBI, do they start pulling on threads that lead to other things? That's where this gets even more dangerous.
I don't think you even need to pull too hard on the threads, right? I talked before this, I spoke about how it was assumed to be or viewed in the framework of individual actors and then escalated, right, to the entirety of a promotion and a sport. This statement, in my opinion, tries to reduce it back, right? Tries to reduce it back to individual actors, right? We're naming James Krause, we're naming Derek Minner, and we're saying these are the parties, and now we are separating ourselves from them. But to your point, Now the can of worms has been opened, right? Now the spotlight is on the individual promotion and on the sport at large. And I don't think it's as easy as to say, hey, these people are gone, wash our hands of it, and now we're done.
Can't do it.
There's way too much attention on it. And I think if you read the statements by the regulatory bodies of gambling, they're not concerned. They don't mention James Krause, right? They don't mention Derek Minner. They don't mention that particular fight, right? They state they have concerns about, can the UFC prevent fight fixing? And that is not addressed in that statement by the UFC, right? They are just saying these individual actors, we are separating from them. It's going to be very important for the UFC over this however long this is playing out to now prove that they can control this and they can oversee their fights without the threat of fight fixing. And until that happens, I don't see regulatory bodies allowing gambling on this.
This is the most serious threat to the future and growth of the UFC in quite some time, if not ever. And dare I say, obviously the health of its competitors paramount, but this is akin to when TRT was, running through the company, and they were trying to, stop the bleeding there, so to speak. And you could say that in terms of, integrity and legitimacy, if people don't believe that what you are doing is on the up and up, there's a huge problem there, especially when it comes to fighting and combat sports, which, there's a wonky decision there. There's the New York Commission changing. There's just so many things that could be problematic. And again, important to note, as you said, they want to know if the UFC can stop this from happening. No one is accusing the UFC right now of saying they fix fights. That would be probably the worst thing that could possibly happen. But could they stop this from happening? And then in retrospect, you start thinking about, everything is so open in the world of MMA. Like multiple fighters are in the locker room. Different teams are in the locker room before a fight. They're all at the PI. They're all at the locker room. There's an article written by Mark Ramundi, who has also done a fantastic job of covering this for ESPN. And there's an article written where he spoke to a coach who was in the locker room before a fight and sees that another fighter who's training, warming up in the same locker room, he sees something about the fighter being off. He pulls out his phone. He places a bet against the fighter. Everything is so open, and maybe this will lead to more separation between everyone. Where if I'm at the PI and I see another guy getting rehab on some injury, I see TJ Dillashaw I'm just saying, this is just an example. It didn't happen, but TJ Dillashaw, someone is getting rehab treatment on an injury before a big fight. You might say, whoa, something seems off here. Everything is just too, it feels like loosey-goosey, as opposed to if you play for the Philadelphia Eagles, it's all in-house. The Bengals aren't training, they aren't warming up, they aren't getting treatment in the same facility that the Eagles are. And so maybe that's one thing to keep an eye on as far as changes that will come as a result of all of this, because I can assure you, forget about the punishments, forget about the ramifications, forget about the repercussions. Changes are going to come. They have to, in order to stop something like this from becoming widespread. One last slide. As of right now, BC, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, PEI, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Quebec, all saying as of right now they are not going to stop MMA betting. And this is once again from Aaron Bronstetter, who, like I said, massive story in Canada, has done a great job of covering this, not just as it pertains to the Canadian angle, but all angles.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think this is huge. These last two commissions continuing to accept bets on UFC fights, because imagine if all of Canada just banned it. It was just, nope, can't bet on the UFC here. I mean, that's the ramifications of not being able to gamble on it because of distrust with the promotion would just be massive, because then you're getting people that can't wager on it. And a lot of people tune into these fights because they have bets placed on them. And then just for the casual fans, and if now you're tuning in without any bets on it, you start to wonder, why can't I bet on this? Is this already fixed? Do people know things? Are judges doing things? The integrity of the UFC comes into huge question. So I think that British Columbia, Quebec, I think these keeping the wagering open is actually a pretty huge story.
For now, yeah. And
yes.
We'll see. As far as we know, as of right now, it's just New Jersey that is saying no James Krause fights. But then we find out on Friday, UFC saying, if you're being coached by this guy, you can't fight here anymore. And this is a lot of fighters. Like I said, the Molinas of the world, the Marquezes of the world, the Brandon Morenos of the world. Some of them have come out in support. And, Jason House, who was in this studio not that long ago, represents a lot of those fighters. I asked them if they wanted to put out a statement about any of this. He also represents Krause. No statement, no word as of right now.
And one thing you mentioned, the Bengals, the Eagles, these NFL teams, like these gaming operators, as big as the UFC is in our lives, and it's the forefront, it's not really the main focus for these sports books. I mean, they're getting almost all of their action on the NFL, on the NBA, on the NHL, on these other huge leagues. I would be curious as what the percentage they're getting on UFC fights. I mean, it's not like they're losing the ability for people to bet on the NFL, which would be far and away their biggest income stream.
But
go ahead.
I was just going to say, in those sports, right, how carefully scrutinized are those injury reports? How carefully scrutinized are the line movements and things like that? This is the lack of attention and regulation to this that had existed in MMA previously that is now being shown to be needed, right? If we take it out of the sports world and think about stocks, finances, right? Essentially, that information is insider information, right? That's insider info. That is what the heart of being able to make financial decisions based upon, if I'm in the locker room and I see somebody looks injured, I can now utilize that information if I'm not prevented from doing so, right? If there are not regulations and things in place to prevent me from doing that, and that creates a whole can of worms that we're now seeing open up.
And even if they say, all right, no coaches, no training partners, whatever, how are they going to monitor someone texting a friend?
It's very difficult.
It's super difficult. Now, again, I see a lot of people saying like James Krause ruined it, and maybe he was too, brash about it all. But even up until now, like don't think for a second that he's the only one who's betting on fights associated with his fighters. And we don't know that he ever bet on anyone. We have to be very careful. We don't know if he bet on any of his fighters to lose, right?
We know not at all about fight fixing at this point, right? There is no proof. Nobody has come out with any report or anything like that fight fixing has occurred. But what this is opening up is what we've talked about, that the regulation wasn't there. So the opportunity to do it existed previously. It could have been done. Purely speculatory. We can assume that it has happened, but that's speculation.
Yeah.
But the opportunity was there, that the safeguards were not in place to prevent this from happening. And now they are starting to be implemented, UFC making statements and preventing their fighters and athletes from doing it. But this is just the beginning.
Yeah, and these commissions are raising questions. They say that there's suspicious activity. And I do believe, and don't be an idiot, obviously not rooting for this, but I do believe that this is going to get a lot worse, that there is more to come.
Can I just point out, I think we have to revisit this, that in 2015, November of 2015, there was a fight between Leo Kuntz and Tae Hyun Bang where the line moved majorly toward Kuntz and away from Bang. And then it was reported that before the fight, the UFC notified both of them about the line movement and said, obviously, there's going to be consequences and penalties for any funny business that happens here. Bang, the one who the line moved away from, right, ends up winning the fight, making it a lot more confusing. There was an investigation, and it appears in 2017, it was reported in 2017 that Bang was sentenced to jail time for accepting a bribe and conspiring to fix a fight. So there was somebody who literally went to jail for this. Again, he ended up winning the fight.
And gave back the money, right?
It was reported that he placed half of the money that he received in the bribe on his opponent, at some point changing his mind and winning the fight. Maybe the warning from the UFC was enough to do that. But he reportedly also received death threats from organized crime figures who were involved in betting on that. So this has happened. Like, we have seen a fight be influenced in this capacity. Now, again, he wins the fight, right? So that kind of changes the dynamic of this. Because he wins the fight, because he does not throw it, because he does not lose, it changes what has happened here or the reporting of the events. But this man, a fighter in the UFC, went to jail because he accepted bribes to fix a fight that he ultimately ended up winning. So this has happened, and now the can of worms has been reopened and more spotlight has been shown on this. I think we have come so far in terms of how we understand gambling that this is what's catching it up to speed, right? Back then, I think the gambling, especially in the MMA world, was not as well known and not as well trafficked. And now...
Also, all these states didn't legalize it as well.
Yeah, well, DraftKings... FanDuel, now you can open your app and gamble on it. So there's a lot more prevalence, and it's in the broadcast and things like that. So, yeah. This is a huge, it's the biggest story that there is in this sport.
So we're going to talk more about this, obviously, not just today, but in the days and weeks and months ahead, even back into the show. But that's basically the timeline. That's where we stand. That's where we sit. It's, like I said at the top, a developing story. It's a story where new layers are coming out each and every day, hour. Here's the final timeline. And let's see what happens. This could be one of the biggest things in the history of the sport, and one of the worst things as well, unfortunately.